All right, listen, this one's wild. You know, Mike Tyson, the baddest man on the planet, right? The guy who used to knock people out in like 30 seconds. Well, here's the twist: nobody expects Mike Tyson finds peace in Islam. Yeah, like the man who was once pure chaos rage and raw power now talks about finding inner peace, discipline, and faith. And honestly, that blows my mind because we always think of strength as physical. But here's Tyson saying real strength is in surrender and spirituality and self control. And I think that's a lesson we all need right now. A faith is often spoken about as something distant or intangible, but when you hear Mike Tyson talk about it, suddenly it feels raw, real, and immediate. Here's a man who has lived through extremes most of us can't even imagine. From the chaos of growing up in tough neighborhoods to becoming the youngest heavyweight champion in history, his entire life was driven by raw power, aggression, and survival. Yet beneath all of that, there was always a hunger for something deeper, something stable that could hold him together when fame, money, and the spotlight weren't enough. When Tyson speaks about finding faith through Islam, it isn't delivered like a preacher's sermon. It's not polished or rehearsed. It's spoken with the honesty of someone who has been broken, who has hit the lowest lows, and who knows firsthand that external victories don't silence the battles inside. That kind of faith is not just belief, it's a grounding force, a compass in the middle of chaos. In the Joe Rogan podcast, what makes this conversation stand out is how faith becomes the central theme, not in a detached theological sense, but in the way it transforms a person's daily choices and their outlook on life. Tyson talks about the structure, the prayer, the discipline that Islam demands, and how those rituals force him to slow down, reflect, and recognize something bigger than himself. For a man whose life was once defined by destruction, violence, and impulse, the idea of surrendering to God became a form of strength, not weakness. Faith, in this sense, is not abstract. It's a daily practice that reshapes how a person thinks, acts, and responds to the world. And what's fascinating is seeing Rogan, someone who's always curious about consciousness, psychedelics, martial arts, and the mind, listening with that same curiosity as Tyson lays out what faith has done for him. It becomes less about religion as a label and more about faith as a tool for human survival and human flourishing. Faith, in Tyson's words, is like armor. Not armor that shields him from life's punches, because he's taken more than most, but armor that keeps his spirit intact, no matter the blows. He explains how prayer isn't just a ritual, it's like medicine for the soul. It resets him, gives him clarity, keeps him humble in a way the roar of a crowd never could. There's a brutal honesty when he admits that without faith, he would still be lost in chaos, chasing after things that never satisfied him. That vulnerability is what makes the message so powerful. It's not about being perfect or pretending to have all the answers. It's about acknowledging weakness, facing demons, and finding something higher to lean on. Discipline is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, especially in conversations about success, sports, or self-improvement. But when Mike Tyson talks about it, the meaning shifts into something much deeper. This is a man who reached the absolute pinnacle of physical dominance through training, repetition, and relentless drive, yet he admits that all the discipline in the world in the gym meant little without the discipline of the mind and the soul. In his conversation with Joe Rogan, discipline comes alive as a force that reshapes the inner life, not just the outer body. Tyson explains how in Islam discipline is embedded in every part of daily living, from the timing of prayers to the food you eat to how you treat other people. And this kind of order becomes a foundation that holds him steady when chaos is always knocking on the door. For someone who once thrived on unpredictability, this kind of structured life becomes a path toward peace. When Tyson breaks it down, discipline is not about punishment or restriction, but about freedom. That sounds contradictory at first, but what he means is that without discipline, a person becomes a slave to their impulses, constantly chasing desires that never satisfy. With discipline, however, there's clarity and a sense of direction that cannot be shaken by outside circumstances. Joe Rogan often explores similar ideas on his podcast when he talks about martial arts or fitness, how discipline in those practices becomes a framework for living better. Hearing Tyson align that with Islam gives the concept another dimension, because now it's not just about training the body or mind, but training the soul as well. The way Tyson frames it, every prayer is a kind of training session, every fast a sparring match with the ego, every act of restraint a fight won against the part of yourself that wants to stay in discipline. This is where discipline becomes more than just a habit, it becomes identity. Tyson, once known as the most feared fighter alive, now identifies himself not through knockouts, but through how consistently he submits to the order his faith demands. That shift is enormous, because it shows how discipline can evolve as life evolves. For him, it's no longer about how hard he can hit or how fast he can train. It's about how consistently he can stay humble, pray, and keep his ego in check. Rogan listens to this with that mix of curiosity and fascination, the way he does when someone describes a mental or spiritual practice he hasn't experienced himself but deeply respects. The conversation makes clear that true discipline is not confined to the ring, the gym, or even the body. It's something that filters into every thought, every choice, every word that comes out of your mouth. Transformation is one of those themes that people love to talk about because it suggests change, growth, and the possibility of becoming someone entirely new. But when it comes out of Mike Tyson's mouth, the weight of it hits harder because of who he used to be. This is a man who was once defined by chaos, fear, and aggression, a fighter whose presence alone could terrify anyone standing across from him in the ring. His transformation, though, didn't come from just getting older or walking away from boxing. It came from an internal journey, from finding something greater than himself to submit to. And that's where Islam became the turning point. On Joe Rogan's podcast, when Tyson opens up about how his faith guided his transformation, you can hear it's not just surface-level talk. It's not about image management or creating a storyline. It's about a real lived process of shedding an old skin and being reshaped into something more whole, more centered, more human. The transformation Tyson talks about isn't flashy. It doesn't come with bright lights or loud celebrations. It's quiet, subtle, and consistent. He explains that Islam gave him a framework where every single day there's a chance to refine yourself, to start over, to recalibrate when you fall short. That is what makes transformation real. It's not one big moment, but a series of choices stacked on top of each other, each one carving away at the old version of yourself until something new emerges. Rogan often gravitates toward these kinds of conversations because he's fascinated with how people reinvent themselves, whether through discipline, psychedelic experiences, or profound life challenges. Listening to Tyson describe transformation through the lens of faith adds a dimension to that fascination because it shows how spiritual practices can produce changes just as radical, if not more, than any physical or psychological method. Tyson's transformation is also tied to humility. For someone who was once on top of the world, adored, feared, and envied, to now speak with vulnerability about weakness, failure, and the need for God, it's an image shift so dramatic it forces people to pay attention. It challenges the idea that strength is about dominance and control. Instead, Tyson suggests that true transformation comes from letting go of ego, from surrendering to something higher, and from admitting that the old way of living was destructive. That's what makes his story resonate. It's not about becoming a saint overnight. It's about constantly battling with who he used to be and choosing each day not to go back there. That fight is more difficult than any championship bout. But it's also more rewarding because it changes not just how he looks on the outside, but how he feels and thinks on the inside. When you hear Tyson describe this process, it's impossible not to see how transformation is contagious. It sparks curiosity in Rogan, who leans into the conversation, asking the kinds of questions that make the audience reflect on their own lives. If someone like Tyson, who lived on the edge of violence and excess, can undergo such a dramatic shift, then maybe transformation is possible for anyone willing to embrace it, commit to it, and accept that it doesn't happen all at once but through small, intentional steps taken every single day. Inner peace is one of those phrases that sounds almost cliche when tossed around in self-help books or motivational speeches. But when Mike Tyson talks about it, the weight of his experiences gives it a raw, unpolished meaning. This is a man who lived through the extremes of fame, fortune, violence, and downfall. And yet he now describes finding peace in ways that cut through the noise of all the glamour and destruction that once defined his life. On the Joe Rogan podcast, when Tyson shares how Islam provided him with a path to inner peace, the conversation takes on a depth that goes beyond the typical surface level talk about calmness or relaxation. For Tyson, inner peace is not about escaping life. It is about meeting life head-on with a sense of grounding that doesn't waver when the world throws chaos at you. That kind of peace is not given. It is earned, and it requires practices that strip away ego, pride, and uncontrolled desires. Tyson paints inner peace as something that comes from alignment between mind, body, and soul. In Islam, the daily practices of prayer, fasting, and reflection create space to quiet the noise of the outside world and face what's happening internally. Tyson admits that without those practices, his mind would still be consumed with anger, greed, and impulses that once drove his worst mistakes. The peace he describes is not the absence of struggle, but the ability to carry calmness even while the struggle is happening. Joe Rogan, who has explored inner peace through meditation, martial arts, and even psychedelics, engages with this perspective in his curious way, leaning into Tyson's words with genuine interest. It becomes clear that Tyson's version of inner peace is not about temporary escapes. It is about long-term stability, the kind that anchors a person no matter how stormy life becomes. Another layer to Tyson's reflection is the way inner peace transforms relationships. He talks about how his interactions with family, friends, and even strangers shift when he approaches them from a place of calmness and humility rather than aggression or insecurity. Inner peace, in his description, is not a selfish achievement. It ripples outward, affecting everyone around him. For someone who once lived as a storm, bringing fear and destruction wherever he went, Now bringing a sense of peace and respect into the room is a complete reversal of identity. That shift is what fascinates Rogan and the audience because it shows how powerful internal change can reshape the external world. Inner peace is not just a feeling, it is an energy that people can sense when they are near you. Tyson's journey also shows how fragile inner peace can be. He doesn't claim to have mastered it permanently. He admits that it takes constant work and that he can lose it if he neglects the practices that keep him balanced. That honesty makes his story relatable because everyone struggles with maintaining peace in the face of stress, temptation, or anger. By grounding his life in faith and daily discipline, Tyson has found a sustainable way to return to peace whenever he drifts away from it. It's not perfect, it's not easy, but it is real, and that reality gives his words a credibility that theory alone could never match. Respect is something everyone wants, but very few people truly understand what it means to earn it and to give it. For Mike Tyson, respect was once about fear. In his prime as the most dangerous heavyweight fighter on the planet, people respected him because they were terrified of him. They respected the power in his fists, the aggression in his eyes, and the way he could end a fight in less than a minute. But as Tyson himself admits in his conversation with Joe Rogan, that kind of respect is shallow. It doesn't last, and it doesn't bring peace. The respect that he talks about now, the respect that Islam has helped him cultivate, is rooted in humility, kindness, and recognizing the dignity of others. It's not about dominance, it's about service. This shift is powerful because it takes a man who once demanded respect through intimidation and turns him into someone who commands respect through humility. On the podcast, Tyson explains how Islam teaches that respect is not only something you give to people who are stronger or more successful than you, it's something you owe to every person, no matter their background, status, or wealth. That lesson reshaped the way he interacts with the world. Respecting others for him became a reflection of respecting himself and the God who created him. Joe Rogan, always curious about cult spiritual practices, pushes into this idea by comparing it to martial arts. In jiu-jitsu or in any combat sport, there's an underlying respect for your opponent, because without them, you can't grow or test yourself. Tyson builds on this by showing that in faith, the respect is broader, more universal, and it teaches you that every human interaction is a chance to practice that value. Respect in Tyson's eyes is also tied to forgiveness. He admits that he hurt many people in his past, sometimes through violence, sometimes through ego and carelessness. Now, when he speaks about respect, he includes the responsibility of acknowledging those mistakes and trying to make peace with them. That honesty resonates deeply because it reveals that respect isn't just about how you treat others in the present. It's also about owning the way you treated people in the past and working to repair the damage. For Rogan's audience, many of whom admire Tyson for his fighting legacy, hearing him speak about respect in such a vulnerable way is both surprising and moving. It reframes the idea of what it means to be truly strong. Respect also becomes a two-way exchange in Tyson's story. He points out that when you show respect consistently, you start to receive it in ways that are genuine, not forced. People no longer respect him out of fear. They respect him out of admiration for the way he carries himself, the wisdom he shares, and the peace he exudes. That is a completely different type of respect than what he once had in the ring. It's deeper, longer lasting, and rooted in something beyond physical power. It's the kind of respect that grows from character, not intimidation, and from humility, not ego. Growth is a word that gets used so often it almost loses its meaning. But when it's attached to the life of Mike Tyson, it carries a weight that cannot be ignored. Growth for him has not been about simply moving from one stage of life to another, checking off achievements on some invisible scoreboard. His entire story is marked by extremes: poverty to wealth, obscurity to fame, victory to downfall, and destruction to renewal. When Tyson talks about growth on the Joe Rogan podcast, it is not polished or theoretical. It is raw and real, the kind of growth that is earned through suffering, mistakes, and relentless self-reflection. For Tyson, growth is not about becoming someone else entirely, but about refining who he already is and learning to carry his past without being crushed by it. That is what makes his reflections so compelling, because they show that growth is not a straight path. It is a jagged climb filled with slips, stumbles, and recoveries. In Tyson's experience, growth is inseparable from humility. He acknowledges openly that for much of his life, he believed growth meant power, more money, more victories, more possessions, more control. But over time, he learned that real growth meant learning to let go of ego, to accept weakness, and to admit when he was wrong. That shift is profound because it shows how much growth can come from loss rather than gain. Islam, for Tyson, gave him a framework for that process. Through prayer, fasting, and reflection, he found himself forced to confront his own flaws and seek forgiveness. Each act of discipline became a step in his growth, not because it elevated his status in the eyes of others, but because it reshaped how he saw himself. Joe Rogan, who is always fascinated by stories of transformation and self-discovery, leans into this idea during their conversation. asking questions that highlight how growth is often tied to suffering and how those who endure the most can sometimes grow the most. Tyson also frames growth as a never-ending process. He doesn't speak as if he has already reached some perfect final form. Instead, he describes it as an ongoing journey, one that requires constant effort and attention. That makes his reflections relatable because it removes the illusion that growth is ever complete. Everyone, no matter their success or status, is still a work in progress. Hearing that from someone who has lived at the absolute extremes of human experience is powerful because it reminds listeners that growth is not reserved for the perfect or the strong. It is available to anyone who is willing to confront their weaknesses and keep moving forward. Tyson emphasizes that growth doesn't always feel good. In fact, it is often painful, uncomfortable, and filled with doubt. But that discomfort is part of what makes the process real. Growth is not easy, and it is not supposed to be. Another striking element of Tyson's reflections on growth is how much of it is tied to his relationships with others. He talks about learning to be a better father, a better husband, a better friend, and how growth is not measured by titles or accomplishments, but by the quality of those relationships. That perspective resonates strongly in the conversation with Rogan because it ties growth back to something universal. At the end of the day, no matter how many fights you've won or how much money you've made, growth is measured by how you evolve as a human being in your interactions with others. Tyson's story becomes a mirror for anyone listening, a reminder that growth is not about perfection but about progress, not about erasing the past but about using it as fuel to build a better future.